I've been using my small workshop now for about a year and a half, and the way that I've used the space has changed many times. I'm continually trying to find the best way of making use of the small space that I have available. So I thought I'd make a video to share with you some of my findings and some tips that hopefully some of you might find useful if you have a small space to work in, or perhaps if you're thinking of building your own small workshop. Before I start, just to give you some more information about the space that I have, my workshop is 4.3 metres by 2.9 metres. That's 12.5 square metres of floor space. In feet, that's 14 foot by 9.5 foot, 134 square foot of floor space. The ceiling height internally is 2.2 metres or just over 7 feet. A question that I often get asked is it big enough? And my answer to that question is both yes and no. Yes, because prior to having a workshop, I did all my woodwork outside in the garden, and that was a nightmare, not only because of the British weather, but also because I had to set up all my tools and pack everything away each time I wanted to do anything. But I'd also say no, because it's certainly not ideal. There's a limit to what tools I can have. For example, I'd love to get a lathe and a proper router table and a welder and so on, but I just don't have the space. And also, during each build, I do have to move stuff around all the time to get to what I need to get to. But for me, any size of workshop is so much better than not having one at all. Tip 1. Put heavy things that can't be easily moved around on casters so they are easily movable. In my workshop, my table saw is on this mobile stand I made out of plywood. I can move it around and position it differently according to the size of the pieces of wood that I'm cutting. I can also wheel it out of the way when I'm not using it. My bandsaw is also on casters. I don't need to move it around as often as the table saw, but I have moved it a few times if I'm cutting something really long. It's also useful just to be able to wheel it out of the way so that I can clean up the dust underneath it. I also have my jointer and thickness planer on casters, which leads me on to my second tip. Tip 2. Try to find multiple uses to make the most of what space you have available. A couple of examples. My jointer and thickness planer takes up quite a bit of space even without the infeed table attached. So I built this static stand over it, almost like a docking station for it to sit under, I guess. This gives me a place to put my drill press and bench grinder and sander, but it's also really useful just as another work surface I can use to put tools on that I'm using during a project. And if you're anything like me, any additional work surface is really useful. The mobile base for the jointer and thickness planer also has space where I can put the jointer infeed table, push blocks and other accessories inside out of the way. This solution does mean that when I'm using the jointer or thickness planer that it's quite low and not at an ideal operational height, but for me that's a trade-off I am happy to make to give me a bit more usable space. I have a separate video documenting the build of the thickness planer stand if you want to check that out. This area where my table saw is can also be used as additional support at my miter station. If I'm cutting a few longer pieces of wood at the miter saw, I move my table saw out of the way and I've made this very low-tech pop-up support table. It's just a piece of plywood mounted to a couple of hinges at the same height as the miter saw base, propped up with a piece of melamine. But it works well and folds up out of the way when I'm not using it. Another thing that has multiple uses is my workbench. I deliberately made my table saw sit a couple of centimetres higher than my main workbench so that the workbench can double up as an outfeed table for the table saw, as naturally I don't have space for a real outfeed table. Also recently I acquired an air compressor and I didn't have anywhere to put it, so I built another docking stand between my bandsaw and wood bin so the compressor sits under there and I can wheel it out whenever I want to use it. The stand also has some shelves where I can store accessories for the air compressor. Tip 3. Use what height you have available for extra storage space. I have a long timber rack that runs the length of my workshop, right up the top. It's just some scraps of plywood cut to the shape of brackets, screwed into each of the uprights along the wall. But I've found that they hold plenty enough weight. It holds all of my longest pieces of wood, basically everything longer than 2.5 meters, and it doesn't get in the way of anything while it's up there. On the wall to the left of it, I've got another rack for pieces longer than 1 meter but shorter than 2.5 meters. Then I've got a box for anything that's between 500mm and 1 meter, and then underneath my mitre station I've got storage for anything that's shorter than 500mm. That system works for me, but I guess the main point is that I've used all space, both high and low, for additional storage. Tip 4. Use wall space for frequently used hand tools. I have a tool wall just above my workbench, so everything I use regularly is at arm's reach. I just use screws into these sheets of MDF slot board. A lot of tools have holes in them already that allow them to be hung. Some things I've made holders for, like my drill bits and clamps. I've also drawn around everything with a Sharpie so I can immediately see if something is missing. I have another tool wall behind my bandsaw that has the stuff I reach for less frequently, and these are on tool hooks that I bought from eBay into some scraps of pegboard. Tip 5. Spend some time thinking about how you are using this space, and dedicate some time during each project to consider how it might work better. Don't be afraid to keep trying new things and moving things around until you settle on a layout that really works for you. As I said at the start of this video, it's taken me a year and a half to find what layout works best for me, and in a workshop this small, I don't think I have too many other options for improving it beyond how it is laid out currently. But having said that, I'd be surprised if it's exactly the same as it is now this time next year. Please use the comment section below if you want to share any more tips you might have. I'd love to hear them. For more information about the tools I use and my workshop, please check out my website at ragandbonebrown.com. I've also added links in the description box below this video to the build videos for my jointer and thicknesser stand, my mitre station and my workbench if you're interested in watching those.